Hi, everyone. I'm here with Ron Herzman today, a professor of the Humanities. And the Redemption Center project is built on a lot of this new field of environmental humanities. And lots of folks kind of look at that as something that kind of starts in the 1970s with Rachel Carson, or maybe even reaches back to the middle of the 19th century with Thoreau or Emerson. But Ron's going to help us understand how humanities authors have been thinking about the natural world for a very, very long time. Okay, and how these are actually very old, enduring questions that the modern field of environmental humanities is asking these days. So where would you like to start, Ron?
Well, one thing that I think would be interesting to say right at the outset is that the authors that I am mostly concerned with or have been concerned with throughout my teaching career, basically Shakespeare and going backwards, all start with a set of assumptions and presuppositions that I think need to be articulated. And also one really basic fact, and that is, of course, in any pre-industrial society, one's association with, one's dependence on, one's interaction with nature was simply much stronger, much more self-evident to everybody who was living at the time. So that, one of the things that I've discovered in my teaching is that an awful lot of my job was to kind of reacquaint myself with things that would have been taken for granted when you were, let's say, dependent on an agricultural cycle, dependent on the stars for your transportation, and to just sort of constantly remind myself and students that that means that there's this much tighter relationship between humans and nature than we ordinarily assume today. So an awful lot of what I do in trying to explain earlier literature and the way that nature needs to be understood in that literature is to start off with that assumption and then go on, maybe push it a little bit further, and to suggest that in earlier times it was a lot easier to understand that humans are a part of nature, not separate from it. And so that the kind of interaction that you have is going to be perceived differently if you sort of see yourself as sort of within an entire larger reality. And that manifests itself in a lot of different ways in the literature that I mostly have dealt with in my career.
Yeah, and we see how in Western Europe and in the Christian world, okay, that it was perceived that we lived in a world of two different books, right? Right.
Sure, that any number of different thinkers on that subject, sort of who were thinking within a biblical perspective, would say that God is the author of the two books, the book of the Bible and the book of nature. And that in a way, we have to learn how to read each of those books in similar ways. The problem is that when we think about reading books, we generally think of having a text. The text has words. The words are there. They're sort of, if not in stone, they're in print. And our job is to decipher those words. In both the book of nature and that other book, the Bible, the assumption was that interpretation was an interaction between the text, whether it's the text of nature or the text of the Bible, where meaning is created in that interaction. It doesn't exist out there somewhere. It doesn't exist on the printed page. It exists when the text is in dialogue with the reader. And the same thing would be true, of course, when interacting with the book of nature. So that what you would be doing in that interaction is, in a sense, becoming, you're both part of the process. And if you look at it that way, both part of the process, then I think you get to what is my major point, and that is that humans and nature exist as part of the same reality, and that it is much better to emphasize the connection than to look at those things that separate us from nature, because it's kind of harder for us to keep that in mind. I mean, we've managed to do sorts of things where if you stand back far enough from nature, you're able to do all kinds of things in terms of using nature for your own benefits. And it seems to me that recovering this sense of communion with nature is part of what reading the texts that I've taught enables us to do, at least for the time that we're doing it. Does that sort of fit here? Does that make some sense?
Yeah, and I see how it resonates, forwards, right? Because even in some of the writings of the Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, okay, one of his very very poetic lines in talking about his experience of this sort of 2-year rescue mission that he had in 1917 and 18 was he wrote, he said, we had seen God in all his splendors, read the text that nature renders.
Nice.
So even Shackleton in 1917 is hearkening back to some of these biblical ideas, some of these Greek ideas, some of these medieval ideas that we're talking about today.
One of the big sort of interpreters for our time of a correct evaluation of humans and their relation to the natural world is Pope Francis and his encyclical Laudato Si. That line is taken from a very famous poem by St. Francis, who, of course, is the role model for Pope Francis. And in that, otherwise known as Brother Sun, Brother Sister Moon, God is praised in and through all of these things. And I think that it's really important to see that Francis himself, Francis of Assisi, when he composed that poem, was not doing something new or startling. He was simply drawing out the implications of reading both the book of the Bible and the book of nature, stuff that was already there, but expressing it in a very decisive way. To make, calling Brother Sun and Sister Moon, if you take that seriously, if you take that as something other than pious metaphor, it really puts you in a very, very different position in terms of where you stand with the created world, literally as part of this creative world, as part of the much larger reality that, it's our job not necessarily so much to interpret as to experience, and that we're changed by experiencing. We're changed by the way that we treat all of the creatures, from Brother Sun and Sister Moon on. And I think that it just makes a lot of sense for me to use that, as I have in many classes, to use that particular text, because it's so condensed and quite wonderfully poetic, to use that as a kind of guide, a kind of Hallmark's notes to understanding the relationship of the natural world in the serious literature from Shakespeare on back.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Francis and Genesis 1, okay, because I think that in a lot of our theological debates, our interdenominational debates about Genesis, okay, there's all sorts of questions about that moment in Genesis 1 when humans are created, what is that translation from the ancient Hebrew of having dominion over nature, or being a steward of nature, right?
Yeah.
And we argue about that a lot, right?
Yeah.
Because it enters into sort of modern notions of the commodification of nature and us individually profiting from it. But what you're reminding us is that in Francis's sort of riff on Genesis 1 in the Brother, Sun, Sister, Moon poem, he actually is focusing on all the other stuff that's in Genesis 1, which is that relationship of siblinghood.
Yeah.
Since we all shared the same parent.
Yeah. And it qualifies dominion as a much more a kind of stewardship, as you said. That it's used by people who say, "Oh, it's okay to go drill in the Arctic, or it's okay to do the pipeline thing." The Bible says we have dominion over nature. It really means you've got to be a good steward, and Genesis 1 works by several levels of analogy, and one of them is to sort of talk about, God creating out of nothing. As stewards, what we have to do is take care of that creation. That we are summoned to be good stewards of what God has given us. And I think that the real problem is when folks just simply isolate that one word, have dominion over them, and use it. What do I want to say? Is a kind of grounds for ecological imperialism.
Yes.
If that's a phrase that I can use. And like so much, it seems to me, of what's wrong with fundamentalist and literalist readings of the Bible in any part of it, it's to simply ignore context. Right. You've got to see the context. You've got to see the context.
Right, and so this gives us a good introduction, I think, to understanding modern environmental humanities writers that are actually trying to restore this relationship.
Yes.
That there's a lot to be said for the thinkers from the ancient Greeks and Hebrews and Romans and the medieval folks and the Renaissance folks, that there was a kind of assumed connection to nature in everything that they wrote, which we have lost here in the 20th century.
And to the extent that we've lost it, we misread the text that we're reading, that is to say, the old text. And of course, also, we've lost the capacity to use that to be a kind of prophetic voice in our own time, to see that there really are alternative modes of looking at things that are just a lot more healthy. Just a lot more healthy.
Good. This is a great start here. Okay, and so again, we're Ron Herzman here from retired professor from SUNY Geneseo, and we're going to be hearing from Ron about some other stuff in another video here.
Okay, thank you.